everybody, in this video, I'm going to give you a brief overview of how a cash for keys agreement works in real estate to give your tenants cash so they give you their keys and get the heck out. So in this video, I'm going to describe how it works and give you a brief overview. So here in Ontario, it's no surprise that the Ontario Landlord Tenant Board is experiencing a delay and backup in processing cases, especially all the cases from landlords with bad tenants. So you might be facing a situation where you have a tenant that you wouldn't like in your property because they're damaging the property, causing trouble, or not paying rent, and you want to get them out, but you don't want to wait to have a hearing actually scheduled at the Landlord Tenant Board because it's a months-long process and you're losing money in the meantime. Totally get it. And in this scenario, you might want to consider a cash for keys agreement. So what is cash for keys? It's simply when you offer cash for your tenants to give you the keys and go out. So it's a mutual agreement to end the tenancy. So what you can do is you can draft up a cash for keys agreement document that you sign and the tenants sign and date, as well as the proper notice at the Landlord Tenant Board using one of their forms. The form you would use is an N11 form, which is a mutual agreement to end the tenancy. So you want to have two forms signed, one outlining the specific cash for keys agreements that you've come up with and agreed upon. The other one is an N11 form, which is the Ontario Landlord Tenant Board official form for mutually agreeing to end a tenancy. When you use this agreement, you can get the tenants out much quicker as long as they agree to a soon enough date that makes sense given how long you're waiting for the Ontario Landlord Tenant Board, and you reduce the risk of not knowing how that hearing is going to go. If your tenant is further going to delay the process, you kind of reduce all those unknowns of how much time, money, and energy you're going to spend trying to get them evicted through the Ontario Landlord Tenant Board when you can simply make an agreement with them to leave earlier. So there are two common scenarios where you might want to use a cash for keys agreement. If you have that tenant that's not paying rent, damaging the property, causing a mess, whatever reason you want to get them out and you don't want to wait for the hearing, it's an option. Also, if you're trying to sell a property that's tenanted, it can be much more difficult to do so because the new owners of that property might not want to have to deal with that tenant not moving out, with properly evicting that tenant because they want to use the property personally. It's just something they don't want to deal with, and new home buyers prefer vacant properties, even new investors oftentimes, because you can find your own tenants and set your own rents. So having a vacant property is desirable. And even though you might have a great quality tenant in there, you might want to ask them to leave, but they might not want to leave. So you could offer a cash for keys agreement in this scenario as well. So the amount of money that you could offer to your tenant kind of depends on your personal situation, how much rent is for that property, the timelines that you have, your unique factors are going to determine how much money you could offer your tenant. However, a good starting point might be offering your tenants 2 months rent and moving costs. That way it kind of covers them for first and last at a new place and the moving costs to get there. In my case, when I did a cash for keys agreement for the first time, we offered our tenants $6,000 and the rent at the time was $2,290 for a 45-day agreement to leave the property. And so that gave them enough time to find a new place, enough money for first and last and moving costs, and was about 2.5 times rent. So it's a bit more than we wanted to have paid, but we really just wanted to get this tenant out and move on with our lives. Thankfully, our tenant realized they're going to be evicted anyways after seeking legal counsel, and they were advised to take our agreement and move on, which they did, and it was a relatively seamless process. We immediately had the tenant sign that N11 mutual agreement to end the tenancy form, and then sign the cash for keys agreement that we drew up. Now, being here at Rockstar, I was fortunate enough to have a great connection with an amazing paralegal that we've worked with for years, to have her review the cash for keys agreement to make sure I was covering all my bases. So I recommend you do the same thing if you can to seek legal advice, but I'll tell you what we put in our cash for keys agreement. Hey everybody, you can now book a free real estate investing strategy call with a Rockstar investing coach, speak with an experienced real estate investor, and get their insight on the next best step to take for you and your situation. The link to book a call at your convenience is in the description below. And now back to the video. It was a one-page agreement, and it laid out the amount of money that we agreed upon, that it would only be paid on the fulfillment of all terms in the agreement, the deadline date to move out, conditions that the home must be fully vacant of all people and personal possessions upon move out, and an acceptance date for the tenant stipulating how much time the tenant had to consider the agreement and seek legal advice. Having a signed cash for keys agreement makes it pretty difficult for the tenant to go back in the future and contest that the N11 was unjust or forced upon them because they agreed to all the terms. Including a grace period for an acceptance date and a note stating that there wasn't any pressure on the tenant to accept that notice makes it very difficult for the tenant to argue anything in the future. Now, you don't want to pay your tenant until they fulfilled all the agreements in that cash for keys agreement. You want to make sure everything's fulfilled before you actually give them the money, because that's their incentive for following the agreement. If the tenant needs the money for their first and last somewhere else, you can ask them to provide proof of that new living arrangement, possibly pay their new landlord directly, but you want to try to avoid doing this if you can. You also want to pay the tenant using a traceable method, such as an email or check, so that they can't dispute you not paying them cash, for example, in the future. So paying a tenant to leave your own property just sucks. Straight up, it sucks. However, if you look at the bigger picture, sometimes it's simply the best move to make because that's the game that we're playing in. And if you've been in real estate for a long term, then your property's likely appreciated a ton, you've earned cash flow, your mortgage has been paid down, and this can be a little blip in the radar of hopefully a longer term successful investment. The interesting thing about this property for me personally was it was a rent to own investment. So when that tenant moved in, they gave me an $8,000 upfront non-refundable option fee for me to give them the option to buy out that home in the future. Now things went south where they damaged the property, fell behind on rent. We ultimately had to do this agreement. But that being said, I got to keep that $8,000 non-refundable fee, so it helped with the damages and the missed rents and the cash for keys that we had to give them. So it was kind of a bit of a win there at least, and that's the beauty of a rent-to-own strategy, which we teach to Rockstar Inner Circle members and in a free monthly class that we also teach to everybody that you can sign up for. Link is in the description, where with the rent-to-own, you get that upfront option payment that can range from $8,000 on the lower end. We've seen it as high as $50,000, $80,000 on the higher end, typically about 20, 25, 30 grand these days. So that's a non-refundable option payment that you collect that gives you a bit of an insurance policy should things go south, like it did in this example for me. So that being said, if you're in a situation where you need to get a tenant out, you don't want to wait months and months for that hearing at the Ontario Landlord Tenant Board and have uncertainty of how that hearing is going to go, if it's going to be further delayed, what the process is. You could offer a simple cash for keys agreement, N11 form, cash for keys, and make sure you hit upon all those conditions that I hit. And ideally, you get legal advice as well before sending it out to your tenants to sign. So with that said, I hope it's helpful. I hope you're not in this situation ever in your investing career. But if you are, it's something to learn from. Onwards and upwards. And until next time, your life, your terms.